Word finding difficulties, or anomia, probably the most common complaint that people with aphasia have. And in fact, if you look further down on this page where I've got a little diagram about classifying people into different aphasia subtypes, you'll see there that the first question that we can ask is, does this person have word finding difficulties or not? And if they don't have word finding difficulties, then we can kind of stop there in terms of do they have aphasia or not, because they don't. Now, word finding difficulties, we find them in other conditions that we don't consider aphasia. We'll see word finding difficulties in individuals with dementia. We'll find word finding difficulties with individuals who have TBI, and actually there's a fair amount of literature to show that as we age, our word finding difficulty decreases, particularly for proper nouns. So word finding difficulty at the core of the complaints of people with aphasia. People with aphasia, of course, are going to have difficulties in all areas of language, but I think because it's a core complaint, it's often one of the areas that we spend the most time testing and that we try to treat. Now, you'll see down in this chart here, there are different kinds of naming errors that we can observe. Everything from an anomic pause, simply that prolonged hesitancy before a word is found, and how long a pause has to be before it's considered an anomic pause is, I don't know personally of any set time limit for that. We all have pauses ourselves to varying degrees. However, I think if you look at some of the aphasia tests, oftentimes if a person is taking 5 seconds or more to name a pictured item, but then they do name it eventually correctly, they're penalized in some point system for doing that. So that delay is at least scored in aphasia tests as being abnormal. Semantic paraphasias essentially we can think of semantic paraphasias, and it's not listed here on your chart. This chart comes from Murray and Clark. Another way to think about paraphasias is word substitutions or sound substitutions. For word substitutions, we call them just verbal paraphasias. A verbal paraphasia just means you've substituted a word. If that word that you've substituted is semantically related to the target, so instead of saying spoon, you said fork, then that is a semantic paraphasia. But sometimes people will substitute words that don't appear to have any semantic relation to the target, and they're real words. In that case, sometimes they're just called non-semantic verbal paraphasias. They're just called verbal paraphasia. Less commonly, you'll see formal paraphasia. Formal paraphasia referring to those words that are real word substitutions, not related in meaning, but they sound like the targeted words. So if I intended to say cage, but instead I said page. Phonemic paraphasias, as the name implies, are sound substitutions. Now, if a person is substituting more than 50% of the sounds in a word, then that tends to be classified as a neologism, right? And if you're substituting more than 50% of the sounds in the words, most likely that word is not going to be recognizable as a real word. Whereas if you substitute one sound, oftentimes you will kind of get it. Nomic circumlocution, talking around a word finding difficulty. Circumlocution is something we often encourage people to do because what we want them to do is, in a sense, instead of having a long, prolonged pause because of a word finding block in the course of a conversation, we want them to keep talking to keep the flow of the conversation going. And of course, usually in the context of a conversation, if we're talking about baseball, right, we both know what the topic is, and I say, my son, we left home, but he forgot his, it goes on the hand. And if your listener will say, oh, mitt. Right? So circumlocutions doing that is an error type when we're testing people, but sometimes we bring that behavior in and try and make it a productive strategy when people are having conversations. Jargon refers to kind of strings of neologisms, right? So lots of neologisms so that the person doesn't even appear to be speaking a language or English. Agrammatism is a word-finding difficulty to the extent to which what happens in agrammatism is people are leaving out these small grammatical functor words like the, and, etc. And that's what gives it the kind of telegraphic quality. Agrammatism, telegraphic speech, they're kind of synonymous. So instead of saying the boy went to the store, your patient says boy go store. Finally, paragrammatism or empty speech. Paragrammatism refers to errors in word finding that are really errors of grammar. So for example, not conjugating a verb correctly. Now you can see here that there are a list of common underlying impairments. So in the previous lecture, I showed you that map of language processing, a psycholinguistic map with semantics in the center, and the lexicons outside of that. One approach to assessing people with aphasia and to devising treatments is to try and, as specifically as possible, identify which one or more processes in the act of naming are damaged: semantic processing, phonological processing, and then create treatments that are more focused towards semantics or more focused towards phonology. In general, it's very hard to, with much confidence, to take a word finding error and say, oh, that error is because of damage here, right? The only exception I know of that is really phonemic paraphasias are pretty much always a sign of some problems with phonological processing. But semantic paraphasia, although the term includes semantics, may be problems with semantic processing. It may be problems with lexical accessing the word form. It may be difficulty connecting the meaning to the word form. So my point here is that we shouldn't jump to conclusions about semantic errors mean semantic impairment, etc. Usually when we come to those decisions about what underlying processes are damaged, we do it through looking at a pattern of errors across multiple subtests. One other point about word finding difficulties is notice that in this list, what we don't see are sound distortions. And I believe if you look at patient 6D, gentleman with primary progressive aphasia, non-fluent variety, who also has apraxia of speech, you'll see him clearly having difficulty with word finding, but you'll also see that he occasionally has some sound distortions, and at least to my ear, sometimes words that are difficult to understand because of sound distortions. Any distortion comes out of the motor system and not out of the language system. So distortions are a result of either dysarthria or apraxia of speech.